what we're going to be talking about today is the New York Times piece that came out a while back that was titled "Screams Without Words." And when I actually Google New York Times "Screams Without Words," your article comes up first from
I
6 days
I
ago,
noticed that.
which is interesting. That's pretty good. NPR even did a piece on it, saying an investigation into the New York Times story is causing chaos. But
Mm.
here was your article that you both of you guys wrote alongside Daniel Boguslaw, where, in my opinion, you did a pretty scathing analysis of the failure of the New York Times to uphold their own rigorous standards in their own reporting in one of the most consequential pieces of reporting surrounding the ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza, where the New York Times tapped into Anat Schwartz, who was a freelancer with no prior experience almost. And as far as I understand, maybe even some experience in the other direction, working with the IDF, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And and
Intelligence
the
unit.
yeah, with their intelligence unit, and uh, we found out that while the original title, "Screams Without Words: How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7," was a pretty damning title for a pretty serious accusation. The article itself had not met the rigorous journalistic standards that the New York Times is supposed to apply, and that uh, it was devoid of any sort of real evidence. No two witnesses, a lot of witnesses that Anat Schwartz went to that had actually been disproven, with a lot of fabulous claims, a lot of exaggerations, and it turned into borderline atrocity propaganda with and it played the purpose of basically justifying Israel's atrocities since October 7 at a time when there was a lot of public backlash. So, you guys, I mean,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
covered this
Jeremy.
extensively, but I'd love to talk and hear your opinion on the article itself in the New York Times.
Jeremy, you landed I think the biggest chunk of that piece. You want to talk about that Anat Schwartz podcast interview, because since she had zero experience in
Yeah.
journalism, I think that actually helped, because she was way more honest than she would have been if she knew what she was revealing in that interview.
I mean, what one of the things that happened, this article has been under scrutiny from the moment it came out, and you had a lot of independent news sites and journalists that were flagging inconsistencies, contradictions, problems with the New York Times narrative. You know, you had Electronic Intifada and Ali Abu Nima, you had the Gray Zone, you had Mondo Weiss, and lots of people on social media as well, going through it and looking at the sourcing and who was featured in it, and you know, a lot of stuff didn't add up, and also our friend, the journalist Layla Al Aryan, who is a really incredible, remarkable journalist. She and I go way back to being at The Nation magazine together. She's an Emmy Award winning, Polk Award winning executive producer at Al Jazeera English. And in fact, she executive produced the documentary about Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist who was assassinated in the West Bank in 2021. And the piece that she did with Sharif Abdel Qaddous was about how the Biden administration was essentially stymieing a real investigation into the assassination of this American citizen journalist who was one of the most widely respected journalists on the ground. So Layla Al Aryan on January 5th sent a letter to the New York Times. The New York Times piece comes out December 28th. Layla writes a letter to them on January 5th that we obtained, that she shared with us, that just laid bare the whole piece and the problems with it, and the Times never responded to her. And so this has been a subject of of discussion, but definitely not in the mainstream. I think most people, they read that article. It's the New York Times. It's Jeffrey Gettleman, who he's a Pulitzer Prize winning travel journalist who does conflict zones, etc. And I think, most people read it and say, well, wow, this must be true. It's in the New York Times. Hamas came in with an intentional plan to conduct a campaign of mass rapes against Jewish women. And that's been the Israeli government's narrative on this for a while. And so, the landscape on social media, a lot of people pointing it out, but in the mainstream discourse, there wasn't really any questioning whatsoever of the New York Times piece. And then a Twitter user who's anonymous named Zay Squirrel last week started flagging some of the social media likes of Anat Schwartz, one of the people who's bylined on the piece that no one had ever heard of. And it turned out that she had liked a number of tweets that really were, not just dehumanizing Palestinians, but in fact, she liked one tweet that called for turning Gaza into a slaughterhouse and dispensing with any rules of engagement and, razing it to the ground. And that tweet, in fact, was cited in South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice as genocidal incitement speech. So and then there were a number of other ones. She also liked a tweet that promoted the lie that there were 40 babies beheaded on October 7th, and another one that said that Hamas is Daesh, is ISIS. And so this is one of the people that then is bylined on this New York Times piece. So we also we saw those social media posts, and at the same time we were working with some people inside Israel to dig around what had been what might be knowable about how this New York Times piece started, and we came across a podcast interview in Hebrew that Anat Schwartz had given in early January, so just a few days after the piece came out, with Channel 12, one of the biggest corporate TV networks in Israel. But it's a podcast, and it wasn't like a huge thing. So we quickly got that thing translated, and we made sure to get it the translation reviewed by 3 separate Hebrew speakers, because we wanted to make sure it was accurate, because the contents of it were incendiary. So we ran it through 3 separate Hebrew translations to make sure that we were going to use the most generous translation, because translation, you can choose how to make somebody sound. We didn't want to make Anat Schwartz sound like a cave person. So I'm sharing with folks on the stream that we really went out of our way to try to make sure that everything we did was accurate, because what the contents of this was Anat Schwartz for basically an hour detailing every step of how they proceeded to quote unquote report this story. And she says on it that she did 150 interviews, and makes really clear that Jeffrey Gettleman, despite the fact that he was the top dog in charge, had essentially farmed out the reporting on an incredibly consequential investigation to Anat Schwartz, a filmmaker with no reporting experience whatsoever. And then the nephew of Anat Schwartz's life partner, they're not married, but his nephew, Adam Sella, who basically was kind of like a food blogger or a culture journalist. And no insult to him. We looked into him. I mean, he's a kid basically who wants to get into journalism. He had started doing some freelance pieces. He actually wrote a couple pieces for Al Jazeera. He was starting to get into more news reporting, not just food and culture that he had been doing earlier. And our understanding is that from Ben Smith reported this, that Patrick Kingsley, the bureau chief of the New York Times in Jerusalem, had introduced Jeffrey Gettleman to Adam Sella, and that seems to be how Anat Schwartz ended up in this. I'm going into this detail; it'll matter later. But so you assemble this, not the A team, not the B team, not the C team, but the totally inexperienced team to run an investigation for the most important news organization on the planet into assertions that Hamas had weaponized systematic sexual assault and rape against Jewish women. They embark on their.
Ask a question here really quickly.
Yep.
Under other circumstances, under normal circumstances, if I'm being as charitable as possible to the paper of record, would they not have been able to tap into actual Israeli journalists who do a phenomenal job in investigative reporting? Because you have, I think it's Plus 972 Mag, you have reporters at Haaretz, you have reporters at Ynet who are not even ideologically aligned with anti-Zionism even at all, and yet have done pretty solid work on even exposing Zakah, for example. Both Ynet and Haaretz have written articles, numerous articles at this point, basically talking about the exaggerated claims from Zakam members and how they lacked any kind of forensic criminology, forensic pathology experience, where they basically discarded some of these bodies without doing proper investigative work that was an absolute necessity. I mean, there are other journalists out there, right, that they could have basically utilized as freelancers that would have loved to get a New York Times
I mean,
byline. I'm
there's
certain.
two ways. Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's done a lot of international reporting and reporting on really sensitive issues. I mean, back in Afghanistan, I did an investigation into a U.S. military special operations raid where two pregnant women were killed along with other people in a raid by the Joint Special Operations Command, where the U.S. soldiers dug the bullets out of the bodies of the pregnant women to try to cover up that it was American munitions. And of course, I don't speak any of the languages indigenous to Afghanistan, so I also had to work with local people. But there's two ways you can approach this as a journalist, and the Times chose neither of them. One is you can work with experienced local journalists, and you're working with them, and you're a team. Or you can work with people that are less experienced, or people that are sort of called, sometimes called fixers. They're people that help facilitate the gathering of news and information. And if you're going down that path where you're not working with another experienced journalist, the correspondent who is experienced has to oversee the whole thing. They have to make sure that the standards are in place. They have to ensure the accuracy. They have to make sure that people are aware of the rules of journalism, and so it's not unheard of or even unethical to work with inexperienced people if there's a sufficient, oversight of the process, and that happens all the time. So I wouldn't necessarily ding them on that, but the New York Times has endless resources. They could have brought in not only they couldn't have, I mean, like you're suggesting, they could have hired local stringers who were very experienced, connected, would have known how to do this, and already had a base familiarity with some of the problems of some of the narratives. And you're right to flag that. Or they could have brought in a reporter that was really experienced in investigating, sexual violence crimes in war. And so neither of those things happened. But what's kind of wild is they start this thing, and according to the podcast interview, Anat Schwartz says that she initially didn't want to do it, that she didn't want to look at images of it, and that's completely understandable. I think she was probably assuming she was going to be having to sit face to face with people who had been, the actual victims of sexual violence or rape, or to talk to witnesses who were going to be describing really horrifying, events. But eventually, she says the Times convinced her to do it, and she starts off by calling all of the hospitals in Israel. She says she calls 11 hospitals in Israel that each have what are called Room 4. Room 4 are specially designated facilities and hospitals for victims of sexual violence or rape, and is calling other crisis hotlines, etc., and is kind of astonished that all of them are saying they had no recorded cases of sexual assault from October 7th that came in. And at one point, she says she describes her conversation with the manager of a sexual violence hotline, and it almost sounds like she's just kind of like not berating him, but just like exasperated and saying, "How is this possible? What are you talking about? What do you mean, no one?" And then she comes across this interview that was given on to a person who gave an interview to a number of television networks in the U.S. and around the world, who was identified as a special Israeli Special Forces paramedic known as G, and he did interviews with his back turned, and he described encountering a scene in a kibbutz where there were two teenage girls that he encountered that appeared to have been raped. He, in fact, said that they were raped. I don't know how he would have necessarily known that just by walking in, but he said that they were raped. The New York Times, when they reported on it, did not say that they were raped. They just described the scene, the condition he found them in, which was one of them had her pants pulled down, and he said that she had semen on her back. And that the other one had her boxer shorts ripped. Remember, this happened very early in the morning. A lot of people were in their pajamas that day, and that she had bruising around her groin. And Schwartz becomes, according to her own words, sort of instantly convinced that this is indicative of a pattern of sexual assault, because there were two women and they were in a room. It was almost an incomprehensible thing that she was saying on the podcast, how you would all of a sudden jump to that conclusion, but it's her words, not mine. And eventually she tracks this guy down and she tries to validate the story and says she's calling around, but no one has seen anything. And in fact, in that whole course of that interview, she never, she talks about how difficult it is to get a second source, but she never describes actually getting a second source. And when it appeared then in the New York Times, if you read it, it's journalists can read this stuff, and I think just even reasonably smart people can understand the trick that's going on. There's an attempt to present it as having a second source because they say neighbors said that the girls were found separated from their families. Now, our subsequent reporting has indicated that that's not true. They actually, according to the family, the girls died in the arms of their mother. And they were also dual citizens of Britain, so the story received quite a bit of coverage. But to just generally sum this up, what it appears is that the New York Times, generally speaking, relied on Zaka, the ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that Haaretz itself exposed as contaminating the crime scenes, putting out incendiary allegations of atrocities that it turned out had not taken place. I mean, the atrocities that took place that are documentable and known are bad enough. And Zaka was running around then talking about Zaka and another organization, babies put in ovens, babies cut out of pregnant, fetuses cut out of pregnant women's bodies, 40 babies, beheaded, all these things. So
can I just
yeah.
can I jump in really quick? As far as the babies cut out of a baby cut out of a pregnant mother's stomach, that is an atrocity that had happened in the past in Sabra and Shatila, as far as I understand, which was in Lebanon, and it was a IDF-backed operation of phalangists that moved into the Lebanese-Palestinian camps and had done untold amounts of atrocities. And as far as a child being thrown into an oven or a baby being thrown into an oven, that also happened in 1948 in Deir Yassin. Leading up to the Nakba, before the Nakba, but as a part of the planned Dalit acts of terror that were perpetrated by Irgun and Lihi, also known as Stern Gang, the terrorist militias that inevitably formed, that ultimately ended up forming the organization that we know as the IDF. So it was 100% a case of projection as well. So that's another interesting framework to operate off of.
I mean, a lot of people have been saying for a long time that that the accusation is the confession in when it comes to a lot of Israeli actions. But overall, and I promise to let Ryan speak too, but just to close the loop on this, there were a couple of specific cases that were identified by the New York Times in terms of a description of an individual victim rather than people who claim to be witnesses saying, "Oh, I saw this rape occur," or "I saw these things happen," or "We saw, genitalia that appeared to have been mutilated or damaged or attacked in a violent manner." And one case was this case in the kibbutz with the two teenage girls, and the other was the story of Gal Abdush, known as the woman in the black dress, whose own family members, some of them, have challenged the New York Times characterization and also said that they were approached under false pretenses to cooperate in the interview and the story. And Ryan knows more about that than I do. But what we sent last night, Hassan, the New York Times, a quite lengthy letter laying out some of the problems, and we did this last week with the other story too. And I think that we've hit a point in this, and many people before us have reported on some of this stuff or pointed it out, but we've hit a point where it's overwhelmingly clear that retractions are in order, if not the entire piece, certainly.
And some retractions have occurred, right? As far as I know, oh wait, I thought that there was one thing that is close to a retraction, I guess, is the daily piece that came out.
Oh, that's different though than the print piece. The print piece has a correction on it, and it's only to correct the age of one of the so-called witnesses identified in the piece. But they've issued no correction, no retraction to that actual marquee piece. The Daily Show, the Daily Show, the Daily Podcast thing. That's in Ryan's lane, and that's a remarkable story.
So this trio of Adam, Anat, and Jeffrey also published a piece together on December 4th, which is key to this entire thing because December 4th is the day that Kirsten Gillibrand, Sheryl Sandberg, and the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations went to the UN and launched this PR campaign, basically attacking feminist organizations for not condemning Hamas for a systematic campaign of rape. The next day, Netanyahu came out and made that exact charge. Biden that evening made that charge. That trio at the New York Times that day published a story. The headline was something like, "What do we know about sexual violence on October 7th?" And you read the story, and it's basically we don't know anything. They'd been investigating it at that point for almost 2 months, and it was clear that they hadn't discovered anything yet. But and this goes to your point about the correction. They did report that the IDF had collected reams of forensic evidence that it was analyzing that would stand up all of the charges that
You
were
mean the
now
internal
being.
police, right? I thought Israeli police.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It basically they just said Israel, like Israeli authorities have collected like enormous amounts of forensic evidence, and so when Kirsten Gillibrand and Sheryl Sandberg are coming after the feminist groups, they're able to look at the New York Times. New York Times says there's just incredible amounts of forensic evidence that are going to be analyzed. December 8th or 9th, 4 or 5 days later, and people can go look at the story now. There's this correction appended at the bottom of it that says an earlier version of this story said that Israel had collected enormous amounts of forensic evidence. In fact, Israel has eyewitness evidence that will be rolling out in the future. In November, Anat Schwartz had written solo bylined a story that said there were tens of thousands of witnesses. And so from the Israeli perspective, they were telling the world, we have all of this evidence. By early December, they had really convinced the world that this was true, that this campaign at the UN, really worked, and it came at a crucial time regarding the war effort. Then they start to say, actually, we don't have all of this evidence. So people start pushing back on it by mid to late December, and then in late December is when that trio comes forward with their Screams Without Words piece to really just put the exclamation mark down and say, look, this is it. We've got it. Anybody else who's still asking for evidence is just a rape denialist at this point.
Yeah. So beyond the New York Times, something happened yesterday where the United Nations sent a team of 9 specialists alongside her name is Prima Patel, I believe, to go on a mission to investigate the sexual violence and sexual assault allegations that were made by the Israeli government. And I looked through it. I also relied on other journalists like Evan Hill looking through it as well, and their summarization of it. And the way that originally this report was presented in the media with the headlines, I fear was very different than what the report actually had suggested. There was an air that it was like presented as though this was an investigation, which it was not. The report itself clearly indicated that it was not an investigation whatsoever, and that an investigation actually should occur, that they were demanding that the Israeli authorities open or conduct an investigation alongside the Office of Human Rights from the UN, something that the Israeli government has obviously been reluctant to do, and as a matter of fact, considered the UN to be outwardly hostile to Israel and anti-Semitic for even suggesting such an investigation occur. And yet, the report itself, from what I saw, was almost a rehashing, with one exception, but almost a complete reiteration of the New York Times Screams Without Words article. They went to the same exact sources. They actually openly state in the report itself that like a lot of those sources had also made erroneous claims, and yet they still went to those sources. There was some open source there was one open source investigator that that looked through thousands of pieces of imagery and found that there was at least circumstantial evidence to imply potentially that sexual assault had occurred, which was, again, this is, as far as I understand, almost identical to the New York Times reporting on the matter, that like, no, there is no hard evidence. There's no like actual two eyewitnesses corroborating the information at all, or any kind of eyewitness testimony was basically coming from parties that had shown that they had lied on the events of October 7 originally, with one exception, and that was that they said.
Remember though. Oh,
What's
go ahead.
that?
Sorry, finish.
Well,
it's
the
important.
one exception is that they said that there was different clarifications, or they basically laid out in the report that there were like there was a different classification for claims that they were making. Circumstantial implied that they did not have like hard evidence. It was not beyond a reasonable doubt to convict anyone, but it was, it was still, in their opinion, severe enough to make these assertions, with one exception, which was where they had firsthand eyewitness or firsthand testimony, they said, from hostages that were released, that sexual violence and sexual assault had occurred on Israeli hostages in the hands of their captives or their captors. And this led them to also make the allegation or make the assertion that that more of that could be happening currently, both towards women and children. So that was the only new information I saw in that report that I had not seen thus far.
I mean, let's remember though the context of this. Why Pramila Patten was doing this versus actual investigators who would be in a position to gather evidence, interview witnesses, would approach this in a forensic criminal manner. Is that when the UN was initially going to send a team to do such an investigation, the Israeli government said, no way, they can't come. They raised objections. They implied that there were anti-Semites on the panel and people with sympathies to Hamas. And then the Israeli government issued an edict to medical personnel at all medical facilities in Israel that they were not to cooperate with the United Nations investigation. And so there was this big blow up between Israel and the office of the UN Secretary General, and it resulted in Israel basically getting its way. And then they send this other team in that doesn't actually have a full, investigative mandate in any meaningful way. And so you have to understand the political context in order to understand what came out of this body, that Israel manipulated the process so that this group of people would be the ones in charge rather than the initial team that was supposed to deploy to the ground. And what's interesting in this report, I mean, there's many interesting things, is that they make clear very early on in the report that they weren't really able to do an independent investigation at all on the ground, and that they didn't have access to almost anything, that everything that was being fed to them was coming through Israeli state institutions. And in fact, they don't really use the word evidence in there, except in cases when they're describing why they don't
call
have
it
evidence.
information.
They call it information.
Yeah.
That they have information to suggest. Now, all over the internet and the headlines and everything. I mean, the way it's the way this has been interpreted by many news organizations and just online people would fail a basic book report in fourth grade. I mean, it fails a basic test of reading comprehension. Most of, as you point out, most of what is contained in this 24-page report is it's like a list of all the Israeli government's allegations that it's made over the course of the months, all of which were sort of distilled into the New York Times piece by Gettleman, Schwartz, and Sella. There are a couple of cases though, and I think this is interesting, where the UN said that it looked into it and it can find no basis or evidence yet to prove that any sexual violence occurred in places where it had been alleged. That doesn't mean it didn't, but what the UN is saying is that they looked into it, even in the peripheral way we're talking about, and they've determined that there isn't sufficient grounds to say definitively that these things occurred. And they do mention they don't call it lack of credibility, but the erroneous statements that were made by certain individuals. But overall, what this was a great victory for Israel, because they were able to launder the narrative and to put the stamp of the United Nations on it, and then to weaponize that. I mean, I've been blasted all day long, Ryan and I, oh, rape deniers, rape deniers. You know, a prominent documentary filmmaker sent me a note. Are you going to apologize? You know, it doesn't matter. Facts don't actually matter. The narrative matters. And that's the whole point of Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda doctrine. You know, it's not about the facts. It's about convincing external audiences to buy your lies.
Yeah.
And the irony is that the story that we did just recently is about kibbutz Beret, where a spokesperson for that kibbutz said that, hey, good for the New York Times for uncovering what they did, when it comes to sexual violence around the country, but in this kibbutz, their story is inaccurate. That was incorrect, and they told us that on the record, and that's the story about the one that Jeremy was talking about earlier with the two girls who were killed. And interestingly, the UN report says that two very high-profile incidents in Kibbutz Beret were found to be unfounded. So they went further than just like we couldn't establish them. They pretty effectively just dismissed them as possible. One of them is this hoax about the pregnant woman with the fetus, and the fetus is beheaded and the mom's beheaded. Like that didn't happen. And then another one they describe as a girl who had been thought to have been a victim of sexual assault, but it turns out that a bomb squad had moved her body away from her family. And so then when another paramedic came across the scene, saw this girl separated from the family, and this became a very high profile case. Now, they don't say which precise case this is. Like, it's a very thin document, and it would be nice if the UN would tell us which case they're talking about. New York Times, very interestingly, in their write-up of the report, mentioned that two high-profile incidents in Kibbutz Beret were deemed to be unfounded by the UN. But then they added, the Times wasn't referring to either of those. But it's completely unclear like how the Times can make that claim, and we don't know yet. And this requires more investigation. But they also said, the UN also said we could not substantiate any sexual assault in Kibbutz Beret. And the New York Times, like we said, had three victims that they identified, that they elevated as victims of sexual violence to establish their claim of a pattern. And two of them were in Kibbutz Beret. And the UN report seems to align with what the kibbutz spokesperson told us.
Ryan, let me throw something else in there. I mean, Hassan, just to give you a sense of like how meticulous we were when we were approaching this, we went and we put together an Excel spreadsheet where we cross-referenced data on every single minor 18 and under. And in fact, in some cases, we went up to the age of 20 just in the interest of fairness, because just to try to cast a wider net. And we looked at we created entries for each victim that day, and anything that we knew about the circumstances of their death, their age, their gender, and then we cross-referenced it with the Israeli government's official list of the dead on October 7th, with then the National Social Security Agency in Israel's list of the dead. Then there is each of the kibbutzes, or many of the kibbutzes that were attacked that day, have their own memorial pages. And then we also cross-referenced it with the lists of Haaretz and other major Israeli news organizations, just to ensure that we didn't miss anything. And in looking at this case that Ryan is talking about, we can't really identify any other child that would remotely fit that description that the Times mentioned in this piece. So, it may sound like this stuff is in the weeds, and people would say, well, why are you focusing on just this? Look at all of these other horrifying atrocities that happen. Well, we're talking about the most important news organization on the planet. We're talking about the most consequential article that news organization published during the course of the Scorched Earth genocidal bombing campaign and attacks against Gaza. We're talking about a news organization that played a key role in getting the United States into the war in Iraq, that has had played a role in multiple U.S. wars. And this article came out, remember, right in the in the sort of aftermath of the exchange of captives between Hamas and the Israeli government, and it came out at a time when Israel was under pressure, even from some of its own allies, because of the massive civilian death toll, where you had that leaders of France and Canada openly saying, "Stop killing babies," and so this story was like a shot of it was a boost in the arm for the Israeli war narrative, and that's why it matters. It matters because this paper has the ability to take lives with its reporting and to influence policy. This isn't just about two individual people and whether or not this or that happened to them. It's about the New York Times. And this story that we're talking about came to the New York Times and other news outlets via the Israeli government. The Israeli government spokesperson, Elan Levy, set up these interviews with this
paramedic,
so-called paramedic. And in fact, this is, I'm sure there's, because you have an interesting audience. I'm sure there are people that have been following this, but just quickly, when he first was the first interview this paramedic did that we can find is on a right-wing Indian television network, Republic, and his back is turned, and he's describing the scene. And the first thing he says, he talks about how he was at his fiance's house, and then all of this started going down on October 7th. And he describes how from Tel Aviv to the Gaza Strip is only 2 hours by car. Israel is a small country, and he says we then arrived at kibbutz Nahal Oz, not Be'eri, Nahal Oz. And he describes the scene, and he even goes as far as to say Nahal Oz means river of strength, river of courage. He's giving sort of color and detail about it. And then he tells the story of encountering these two girls, and he says that they had been raped. Well, the Israeli government spokesperson then puts this up on Twitter, except he changes it. It's no longer Nahal Oz. Now it's Kibbutz Be'eri. And one possibility here is that they realized there's a problem with the narrative because they really couldn't fit the description of the victims to Nahal Oz. There are two sisters that were 20 and 18 years old that are the closest you could maybe think, but it seems clear that they either he misspoke, even though he gave this
with their mother,
description
though, right?
of
Or their
Nahal
grandmother.
Oz. Right. Or they realized they had a problem with the narrative, and so they put it out, and he clips that part of it out, puts it online, and says it happened in Kibbutz Be'eri. And by the time he's then on CNN and interviewed elsewhere, Kibbutz Be'eri becomes the story. And by the time Anat Schwartz comes across it and meets with this guy for the New York Times piece, it is firmly rooted in Kibbutz Be'eri.
Okay. So one thing that I think we all agree on this as well, that we should mention here is the fact that sexual violence is a common occurrence in war and in situations like what happened on October 7, and that there is a likelihood that sexual violence did occur on October 7. However, this conversation is not about the likelihood of sexual violence occurring, but rather the investigation, or rather lack thereof, into sexual violence occurring, a proper investigation into sexual violence occurring, and a lack of forensic evidence and a lack of evidence in general. I just want to point that out so that people don't misunderstand or try to misconstrue this.
And I think
especially
people
systematic
should also,
and weaponized sexual violence directed by Hamas.
and I think people should also understand that there were at least several hundred people who kind of poured across the fence on October 7th. There are reports of basically like gangs coming over and taking advantage of the situation. Like you can imagine, you've never left Gaza your entire life, and now the fence is down. People were just pouring over that border, and so I don't think people should be dismissive of the idea that in the context of that mayhem and violence, that there could have been some sexual violence. In fact, it's interesting. If you look at the UN report that the media kind of spun up to say, to semi-agree with this like Hamas weaponized rape as a weapon of war claim, you look at the way they actually phrased it, they said something like, in the context of the violence on October 7th, it is reasonable to believe that sexual violence may have occurred. And that framing of it, I think, is that is sure, that's reasonable to believe. And the next question is what investigations have been done? What is the evidence that we have so far? And so you got to kind of separate those two things. And then the third thing being a deliberate Israeli-run PR campaign to persuade the world that there was a systematic weaponization of sexual violence on October 7th, and then they kind of make that presentation to the world, and then they just slowly back away. That anybody who asks them for evidence to back up their claims is told that they're an anti-Semite and a rape denier.
I mean, some of the part of the problem with this, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Hassan. I mean, and Ryan and I both have been very clear from the beginning in making the same point as you, and as someone who's covered multiple wars. I know very well how prevalent sexual violence is. I mean, women get targeted. Look at what happened also, like in the Arab Spring uprising in Egypt. You had women being assaulted. In protests in the United States, you have women being assaulted. The UN just did a report about the Israelis assaulting Palestinians in their prisons.
And there are first-hand accounts for that one, by the way, and evidence.
Right. There's a higher, well, Palestinians are going to be held to a much higher standard of evidence than the Israeli government when they're making these kinds of allegations. But I also think that one of the factors we need to really recognize here is that when a nation state organizes a propaganda campaign, and they make these kinds of allegations in the absence of concrete evidence, and they're doing it in an attempt to dehumanize an entire population to justify killing them, they are also simultaneously doing a disservice to any potential real victims of sexual violence, because they are using this as a political cudgel. They're using it as a genocidal cudgel rather than treating it as a criminal investigation that needs to be pursued. One thing I've noticed, and I think actually, Hassan, you and I talked about this last time we hung out here. If you look at the tone of the actual sex crimes investigators in Israel when they're interviewed, there is a much more sober, fact-oriented manner in which they talk about this. Because they're professional investigators of these types of crimes. They understand the complexity of it, the nuance of it. They understand the psychology, the horrors that set in with someone who has survived or witnessed a rape or a sexual assault. And the tone of those people who are professionals stands in stark contrast to the jingoistic propagandists of the Israeli regime. And I think it does a disservice to an actual inquiry into any of these kinds of acts that may have taken place that day. But the person whose words constitute the headline of the New York Times piece, Screams Without Words, Raz Cohen. Now, there's problems about his story, and we can get into that if you actually want to, but that's not the point I'm making right now. He says he finally settled on a narrative for what he witnessed, where he says that the people that he witnessed committing a very brutal gang rape were not Nukba, not special forces of Hamas, but ordinary people. And he's a veteran of the Israeli Special Forces. So he's saying that they very clearly were not Hamas. Yet his quote, Screams Without Words, becomes the title of an article whose thesis is that Hamas did this. Hamas came in with a systematic plan. I mean, so even their own witness in here is saying something that's contradicting the thesis, and his statement is used as the headline for the article.
Yeah.
Hassan, let me add one more thing that about how I've been thinking about this. Like, so on the one hand, it is incredibly remarkable that there isn't a single Israeli woman who has made a claim that she was sexually assaulted on October 7th. You have a lot of people who say, why don't you believe Israeli women? Well, 0 Israeli women have come forward. So some people said, well, you're setting the bar too high. I said, I'm not setting the bar too high. If an Israeli woman comes forward with a credible claim, that's all we're asking for when it comes to a credible complaint. Then people say, well, of course they're not still around. They have been killed. And maybe that's true. But what I add to that is that's where Israeli claims of having reams of video evidence, photographic evidence, and forensic evidence come into play. They made that claim all throughout November, that they had collected that evidence from these victims. The fact that they never have turned over that evidence and now are making these bizarre claims that they don't have the evidence because of Jewish burial traditions and the kinds of excuses that should not have even gotten past an editor. Like, no, go back to your source. That's not a serious excuse. And also, we reported 2 weeks ago that you have so much forensic evidence. What happened? Were you lying then, or are you lying now? So that's what I say to people who have a very reasonable follow-up when they say, well, of course no women have made that accusation because then they were killed on that day. How can they make an accusation? Well, then you have to go back to Israel making the claim publicly that they had the evidence that would prove it.
Yeah,
now no longer saying that they
mountains
have
of forensic evidence and firsthand accounts and a firsthand testimony that is not conflicting with one another.
Right.
Yeah. So the only thing that we do have actually a rigorous standard applied for is basically the claims that were made that were later falsified. That's the craziest part about this story. Like I said, with one exception, where we don't have any evidence, at least public evidence, but claims made by Israeli captives, hostages, because the UN report, like I said, what's up?
If you notice in that report, there's a huge difference in tone between what the UN reports about what they know about the hostage situation and what they know on October 7th. October 7th, they say, in a broad context of violence, it's reasonable to conclude that something happened. Like very, very low level confidence. When it comes to the hostage thing, they say there's clear and convincing information, I think is the phrase.
Much higher, yeah, which they openly admit is a much higher standard that they applied in that situation. Like firsthand testimony is what they have
which
for
is
that.
what we're asking for, right?
Yeah. And there is one, I guess, out of like I've been looking through every single instance and all of the hostage testimony that has come out. And I remember that even before the original, even before the big 7-day cessation of hostilities where there was a hostage swap that occurred, there was an older hostage that had given an impromptu interview to the media, which was heavily criticized internally in Israel, and the hospital person that allowed this to happen was actually, well, I don't know if they're still let go, but they were sent out on an extended hiatus for heavily criticized, heavily scrutinized. But I remember in that original hostage testimony that was broadly publicized, there was one instance where one of the hostages that was carried into Gaza was reportedly hit with straws and was humiliated and also sexually assaulted in that regard, where people were like hitting her with people were hitting her in the, I don't know how to talk about this in a delicate way, in her butt, basically. I remember something along those lines, which does meet the standard of sexual assault and sexual violence, and also ritualistic humiliation. Beyond that, I have not seen any public hostage testimonies that corroborate. So I don't know if the UN team is.
There was one, I think, today or yesterday in the Guardian, where they said that they had spoken to other hostages,
Yes,
who had been abused by previous
Yes.
captors. And that's the kind of like firsthand, or I guess that's secondhand by now, but that person spoke firsthand to the victims. Like that's the kind of credible testimony that you want, that the public wants, so that we can get to answer.
I mean, I think also what we're gonna, if there's really a historical reckoning with all of these events, and there is a proper tale of all that happened and facts actually matter, I think part of what we're gonna see is that when Hamas launched what they called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, they had certain objectives in mind. They had certain tactics in mind. They were working with at least 4 other armed factions from Gaza, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And then, as Ryan indicated earlier, you had a variety of private actors, some of whom, or many of whom, may not have even been aware until it had already started that, the prison fence had been broken, and there was an attack happening inside of Israel. And Hamas itself said, if you recall, during the first truce where there was the exchange of captives, that it wasn't able to locate every single hostage. Well, the reason for that is because Hamas wasn't holding every single hostage. Islamic Jihad had some, other political factions had some, but then private people also took them and then tried to sell them to Hamas or other organizations. And so, it's possible that at this point now, I think all of the hostages' lives are in grave danger because of the Israeli assault, the lack of food
From
and
famine.
supplies in
Yeah.
Gaza. It's a horrifying situation for everyone in Gaza, including the Israeli prisoners. But the point I'm getting at here is that you can have, on the one hand, a narrative from certain people who were held hostage that were released, where they're describing pretty humane treatment at the hands of their captors. In fact, in this piece in The Guardian that came out, I believe it was today, this released hostage is describing how her captors at one point put mattresses over them and put their own bodies on them to prevent them from getting hit by shrapnel from their own country's munitions that were being dropped on them. There have been many testimonials about being treated humanely, although it was difficult, and many hostages released said it was really terrifying when the Israeli government was attacking. So I don't mean to babble on and on about this, but I think it's an important distinction if we care about facts, that there's not just Hamas. There are several different players here, and what I suspect is that if you were able to divide who was taken by whom, that you're going to hear different tales of how they were treated depending on who was holding them.
Yeah. One really important part that stood out to me in the Guardian article that you guys are referencing is actually the hostages that said that they had heard of accounts of sexual violence that some of the other captives were subjected to. They wanted to bring it up to the Hamas commanders, who they, in their own words, said would be very receptive to listening to what they had to say. So that, once again, reaffirms the exact same position. Now, you might not think that it is because these guys care about the humanity of the hostages. After all, they did violently kidnap these people, right?
Oh, they're a commodity. They're a valuable commodity.
Exactly. Even from the perspective of like being a rational actor, every single person that was a part of the operations on October 7, which of course was very violent and had a massive civilian death toll, still had a rational interest in taking hostages, not simply, in the words of Israel, to like take them back to Gaza and like humiliate them and rape them or kill them, but instead to use them as leverage on the conditional release of Palestinian prisoners, including high profile Palestinian prisoners as well. So that I think is like something that's lost in the media narrative for some weird, unforeseeable reason, that
Let's
like
remember
these
also,
guys are barbarians and they're not thinking in a rational manner at all. There's no calculation here. They're just purely responding to their primitive desires of like raping Israeli women.
Because this is the narrative that occupying powers, colonial powers, oppressive forces use throughout history. You have to dehumanize not just the enemy in a military sense, but the population that enemy comes from. You have to dehumanize all of them in order to justify your actions. And the United States has laundered so many of Israel's dehumanization efforts, not just in this 5 months of attacks against Gaza, but all through history. And let's remember too, have people forgotten Abu Ghraib? Have people forgotten Guantanamo? The CIA black sites? I mean, the United States itself ran a secret kidnap program where it was snatching people off the streets of cities across the world, taking them to secret prisons, torturing them, including sexual torture of prisoners, and then shipping them off to a gulag where they tried to hold them with no respect for the Geneva Convention, etc. So, and then you have the reports, not just the sexual violence reports about Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons, but just straight up also physical violence and psychological torture of Palestinian prisoners. Um, those stories that are actually documented at this point with facts and evidence, etc., are sort of faded into nowhere, and we talk about a lot of allegations, and the word Hamas is used to, with this broad brush, might feel good for the narrative, but if you care about facts, then you're going to actually want to, and you're talking about crimes, then you need to identify specific perpetrators of these crimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the UN report actually they made a point to say we did not even attempt to make any attribution of any of the violence, distinguishing between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or gangs that just came across the border. Like they were very clear. Like what we're presenting here is not we're not claiming that this is Hamas. Obviously, Hamas, the one that planned the operation, and none of it happens without Hamas. But they were very clear about that.
You know who you should have on this show, Hassan? I mean, since you got the Yemeni pirate, that kid that went viral all over the place. You and I were talking about that you were able to find him. There's a couple of great accounts online that have been looking at Israeli TikTok videos, but there's one really interesting
I
account.
really hate you, BM.
Yeah, BM. You should have BM on. But I mean, there's a bunch of Palestinians that have been doing this too. But I really hate you I think that'd be an interesting interview for this show. It's yeah, but just so your audience understands, there's all these Israeli soldiers. They seem to be obsessed with going through the underwear drawer of Palestinian women in Gaza, and dressing up in their lingerie, and yeah.
I don't know what happens there. I don't know what is like the mentality there, but that is there are a lot of there's a lot of that. I feel like I feel like there's been less. I think that I remember reading a report from IDF Command saying that they need to like clamp down on the social media activity of the soldiers on the ground, considering that it was becoming more and more of a problem. You also had, on the other hand, the IDF's very own Telegram channel that was engaging in atrocity propaganda for a not insignificant number of people. It was a version of a much more popular Telegram that's like owned and operated by other Israeli people and not directly linked to the government. But what was it called? 72 Virgins, I think. Yeah.
Mm.
So I think that the IDF at least originally saw a lot of value in the horror that they were committing, the horrible acts of inhumane violence they were committing in the Gaza Strip, from the perspective of like galvanizing the Israeli public. So much so that they basically made their own Telegram channel after seeing the success of the other one. But now it does seem like there are less and less Israeli occupying force members in gear openly showcasing their endless untold cruelty.
It's less violent in the sense that like for a long time you were seeing a lot of like buildings blown up and violence against other human beings, and maybe the order came down that's like, look, you got to cool it, and so cooling it means, well, I'm just putting on some lingerie. I'm not hurting anybody here.
Yeah.
You get the picture of the kid and the guy in laying in a baby crib. Like he's not like blowing the house up. So maybe that's
or riding like children's bicycles.
Right.
Riding children's tricycles. Yeah, like things like that.
But it's mocking Palestinians rather than actual like video of either destroying their homes or like killing them.
Though that one of the characters in the New York Times piece is a guy named Shoam Guetta, and he was with that guy Raz Cohen at the Nova Festival, and in the New York Times piece, he's describing himself as having witnessed these events on the Anat Schwartz podcast that we translated and transcribed, she says that Roz Cohen witnessed this, but that everyone else who was with him was looking in a different direction. But then in the piece, he's presented as a corroborating witness to Roz Cohen.
Yeah.
But that guy, Shoam Guetta, then deployed with the IDF to Gaza. And you can go and look up, you could pull it up right now, look up his TikTok account. And he's a fashion designer in Israel. And he posted all these videos on, if you go in our story on the, if you search his name, I mentioned this, but he's rummaging through Palestinian houses in Gaza. And one of them he has.
How do you spell his first name? I remember.
I think it's on
Shoam.
Some of his good ones are on Instagram.
Wait, say it again.
Shoam.
Oh,
Shoam. Yeah. If you look at him if you look him up and you pull up his TikTok, this is one of the guys who is one of the witnesses in the New York Times piece, Screams Without Words. And then he, so like go to the bottom of that paragraph. Go to the bottom of the paragraph there, and then you should be able to click on the link because I mentioned that he's been rummaging through Palestinian homes.
He might have deleted his TikToks of doing that. Oh, wait, never mind. There is some here still.
Let's see. So scroll down and see if there's any of him there.
No, he's peeing. He's peeing.
Yeah, then he's like dressed up in people's clothes, and he's in their thing, and he's dressed up as in a kid's Batman costume at one point, and he also created like a T-shirt for his fashion line that says Nova 10-7, and then it has his face on the T-shirt, and it's really, I don't know, it's really disturbing. But yeah, he's even posting this stuff too.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Anyway, I don't mean to get down this rabbit hole, but he's and this. I mean, let's remember too. We're talking about children that are starving to death right now. The imagery out of Gaza is horrifying, and you have the catastrophe of pregnant women. Of the attacks against the civilian infrastructure. I mean, this is just an unconscionable, sustained crime, and these guys are playing with kids' toys, kids that are probably buried under rubble, and they're playing with their toys, and they're taking their bikes, and they're putting on their costumes, and they're playing with women's lingerie. I mean, this is a deeply, deeply sick series of events that we're witnessing, and we're witnessing it because of social media, etc. They're broadcasting their own sickness.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting parts about this isn't necessarily like the capacity of cruelty for an occupying force. That much is like obvious. Like American soldiers did similar things. They just didn't have the same tech access and the same mass availability of phone cameras and direct access to the internet. You can only get away with doing stuff like this, obviously, when you have air superiority and you're overwhelming a largely civilian population. It's going to be a little bit different if it were, if there was a role reversal, or rather if they were actually fighting an enemy that was evenly matched with their own weaponry, and not like an ascetic force that is forced to make, bathtub rocket launchers and whatnot, and still sees tremendous success despite that asymmetry. But what I find to be really interesting about this is that, again, there's an audience for this. Like, there is a market for this, and clearly the Israeli government itself finds this to be valuable enough that they haven't genuinely put a stop, because this is something that would violate standards of almost every military internationally, because you are giving away your position and maybe much more to potential enemy combatants, right? So on that front, I remember something happening in Ukraine that was similar, where like with a foreign brigade, were actually like telegraphing their location and by posting, then they got rocket striked. Yeah, they got rocket strike immediately after. So like, there's obviously that part that violates like the safety for the operatives, but then also, I think in spite of that, they still see a lot of value in it. Like the IDF sees a lot of value in it because this reinforces, I guess, some of the I would say, sadistic desires from the population overall to enact vengeance and continue on with an ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza.
Hmm.
I think there's also a potential for a fracturing, not necessarily along Lebanese lines, but I think you're coming out of this war. You're going to have armed factions in Israel that are not as obedient to the central government as they have been over the years. I think the radicalizing that's gone on the last years and months, could completely spin out of control for
You had settlers trying to go in, breaking through
right.
the border fence and try to settle forcibly inside of Gaza, as there are currently operations that, ethnic cleansing going on in Gaza. This to me shows the bloodlust that many have inside of Israel to take matters into their own hands. Like, it's not enough that they're bombing them with American rockets, with Mark 84 rockets, precision guided munitions, and a litany of dumb bombs as well, like artillery and even white phosphorus, that they have to sate their bloodlust by personally taking matters in their own hands. And as a matter of fact, putting themselves in harm's way, not by Palestinians, by Palestinian forces, but by potentially opening themselves up to Israeli rocket fire. Like, the Israeli military has killed Israeli hostages that were begging in Hebrew to not be shot, that tried to tried to escape, that were left behind. They killed them. So the fact that these settlers that are trying to go in there, in spite of that, is insane to me, and it shows that there are a lot of people that are increasingly more radical, that are willing to take matters in their own hands.
But look at what opinion polls have consistently shown in Israel from the beginning of this across political lines. Widespread support, in Israel for this war, despite the fact that there's tens of thousands of civilians that have been killed. I mean, it's an unmasking moment in some ways, in many ways, and I Israel really wanted to compare this to 9/11 at the beginning, and to extrapolate numbers and do a comparison to 9/11. You remember the reaction in the United States after 9/11. You had this bloodlust that set in across so many sectors of the population. But in the case of Israel right now, it could well be that what emerges from this is something in some ways more dangerous than Netanyahu. And certainly this war and the way the Palestinians have been treated and murdered en masse, is almost certainly going to give rise to a force that's more radical than Hamas.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's the pattern we saw, with what gave rise to ISIS, etc. Big nation states or powerful nation states, they think that they can stamp out the resistance by wars of attrition and mass murder. But history shows that it just plants the seeds for even more ferocious armed resistance.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think people understand that there are so many former Shin Bet internal security people, like high-ranking officials in the Israeli FBI, openly stating that this is only going to cause radicalization, further radicalization, and yet no one seems to listen. And I think it's fueled by, obviously, years and years of propaganda, an interest in like developing an ethno state, a Judeo supremacist ethno state, and the ethnic cleansing that must happen in order to ensure that. And now, now the population has found itself in the throes of straightforward fascism, while a ethnic cleansing campaign is currently unfolding right in front of their eyes, and they are championing it. And I don't think like a lot of Israelis, even like liberal Zionists, for example, beyond their acceptance of this and what that says about their own morality, I don't think they understand the long-term consequences. One example that I've used time and time again has been that just like with the parallels we saw, LRADs, long-range acoustic devices, were originally utilized in Iraq to dispel, to stop, civil disobedience occurring. And now those LRADs are equipped on regular patrol cars in the Beverly Hills Police Department, being used against American citizens. And the same parallels occur in Israel as well. The skunk, the skunk car that they used to use in the West Bank that sprays a toxic chemical that is almost impossible to wash off, that the Israeli government, the IDF, was utilizing on civilian houses and civilian populations in the West Bank, were used on the Israeli population when they were protesting the Supreme Court, when they were protesting the neutering of the Supreme Court, rather. And what a lot of Israelis do not understand is that the things that you are advocating for will inevitably be used on you as your government becomes more and more right-wing. Post 9/11, we had the Patriot Act. Post 9/11, we had the DHS and ICE. These were agencies that these are agencies that now seem like a permanent fixture of American empire, and yet they did not exist. A much more neutered version of said agencies existed in the INS, and now we can't even see a world without BORTAC. BORTAC is operating inside of U.S. borders. These are guys who are basically being deployed and training overseas, and it is the same principle behind like having a full-blown, occupying, fully geared, fully kitted military person inside of U.S. borders, handling American citizens. It just consistently escalates, and then that fascism comes back and ends up destroying the population itself. And they don't.
Let me jump in. Hassan, I gotta go pick up my daughter.
Yeah, no, this is this was wonderful. I don't want to take up more of your time anyway, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jeremy,
Anytime,
for coming on. This was wonderful. Unfortunately, we end up talking about some of the worst things that are happening in the world, but you guys are doing phenomenal work, and thank you so much for your continued work in the field.
Thank you. Do that thing with BM though, man. Figure out if you can get that person on the show to talk about the scraping of all these videos. I think you'd be a great place to have that conversation.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm gonna DM him right now.
All right. Take care, Hassan. Nice to see you. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Bye. That was Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm of The Intercept. Their latest reporting is very instructive. I covered it extensively on my YouTube page if you'd like to go watch that. We talked about the UN report that came out as well recently about the mass rape that occurred on October 7. Fuck. And now we are going to move away from Israel-Palestine back to the United States of America, back to the election, back to the Supreme Court.
Damn, this guy's good.